Alright, it's time to talk about devolution, y'all, and if you have no idea what that means, well, you know I got you, boo. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So if we're gonna talk about devolution, then you better know what the fresh heck it means. In political geography, devolution refers to the transfer of power from a central government to regional governments within the same state. Now recall from the last video that states, whether they're organized in a unitary or federal fashion, are made up of a central government and some number of subnational units like provinces or states, etc. So devolution occurs when power is transferred from that central government, making it weaker, to those subnational units, making them stronger. And that process can be initiated by all kinds of things, like a constitutional change or the establishment of new parliaments or whatever. But here I'm going to introduce you to the 7 major factors that you need to know that can trigger the process of devolution. Okay, first is the division of groups by physical geography, which can include barriers like mountains or bodies of water or poor infrastructure or simply a massive distance between the capital and the other parts of the state. And if you've been paying attention since Unit 1, and I know that you have, then you'll remember that what I'm describing here is called the friction of distance, which says that the greater the distance between two locations, the weaker their connection, and vice versa. Therefore, when people groups in the same state are divided by physical barriers or great distances, that can pose a challenge to the national unity of a state and the ability of leaders to exert power uniformly. So a good example here is the Basque people in northern Spain. Now, they are a distinct nation with a unique language and culture that are almost completely separated from the rest of Spain by the Pyrenees Mountains. And that feeling of isolation and unique national heritage has led to various movements for independence from Spain over the last century, none of which has been entirely successful. However, significant devolution occurred with the ratification of a new Spanish constitution in 1978, which granted the Basque people the status of an autonomous region. Oh, and by the way, if you're feeling physically separated from getting an A in your class by the giant mountains of ignorance, then you might want to check out my AP Human Geography Heimler review guide. It is the fastest way to study for everything you need for this course, and you can check it out at the link in the description. Okay, the second reality that can trigger devolutionary forces is ethnic separatism, which occurs when an ethnic group identifies more closely with their own people than with the state in which they live. And that reality is often linked to territoriality and leads to calls for a separate state. And this is a big one because ethnic tensions tend to be, real nasty. And states that experience these pressures are often forced to transfer power to these groups in order to relieve that tension. And a good example here is the African state of Sudan, which, as it shouldn't surprise you to hear by now, struggled profoundly with its legacy of colonialism. Now, during the colonial age, Britain ruled Sudan and created a sharp ethnic division between the North and the South. And for various reasons, the British invested heavily in the development of the North while leaving the South kind of destitute. So, when Sudan declared its independence in the 1950s, the ethnic group in the North took power and ruled the entire state, which to the ethnic groups in the South was, to put it mildly, a hot mess. And so that ethnic tension led to 2 civil wars. And after the first, southern Sudan was granted power to become an autonomous region, but even that wasn't enough, and a second civil war led to the creation of an entirely new state, namely South Sudan, and the devolutionary process was complete. And then the third factor that can lead to devolution is ethnic cleansing, which is the process by which a state attempts to eliminate a particular ethnic group by various means, including imprisonment, expulsion, or mass killing. And here we can return to a state that we've considered a few times in this unit, namely Yugoslavia. Now remember that this state's boundaries were drawn by the victorious powers of World War I, and they didn't seem to care that these borders shoved many rival ethnic groups into a single state. Now by the 1990s, there were calls from each of those groups to have their own state free from Serbian control. But the Serbian leader and authoritarian dirtbag Slobodan Milosevic decided not to give in to those devolutionary pressures and instead aimed to relieve those ethnic tensions by leading a campaign of genocide against the Bosnians. However, in the end, the international condemnation of this act and other forces led to the breakup of Yugoslavia and, among other states, a new state for Bosnians, namely Bosnia and Herzegovina. Okay, the fourth factor that can lead to devolution is terrorism, which describes violence carried out against a government and its citizens whose goal is to change political policies. And here a good example is Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. Now, throughout the 1970s and 80s, Northern Ireland wanted independence from British rule and formed groups like the Irish Republican Army, which engaged in violent acts aimed at creating pressure for independence. Now, they didn't exactly gain independence, but in the 1990s, the UK gave in to the devolutionary pressures and transferred more power to Northern Ireland so that they could play a larger hand in their own affairs. And then the fifth factor that can lead to devolution includes economic problems, which are often manifested as uneven development in different regions. For example, Catalonia in Spain brings in metric buttloads of money thanks to its tourism industry. And that wealth and self-sufficiency has led to calls for the region to become independent from Spain. So you got the Basques, you got the Catalonians, and Spain's got devolutionary problems, y'all. Anyway, to prevent Catalonian secession and independence, the Spanish government has transferred more power to that region. And then the sixth factor that can lead to devolution includes social problems, and this is often the case in places that contain geographical divisions between people of different languages or cultures or religions. For example, let's visit our friends in Belgium again. Now let me remind you, Belgium is sharply divided between the Flemish-speaking north known as Flanders and the French-speaking south known as Wallonia. And both groups hold their own cultural institutions and identify strongly as Flemish or Walloon instead of Belgian. And this tension has resulted in calls for separate states, but so far Belgium remains intact. But how long the central government is going to be able to resist that devolutionary pressure is unknown, but probably not forever. And finally, the seventh factor that can lead to devolution is irredentism, which describes a movement of a culturally unified people that are divided by borders to reunite its divided parts. For example, in 2014, Russian troops invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which was a territory that belonged politically to Ukraine. However, since the majority of citizens that lived there were ethnically Russian, Russia used this as a motivation to reclaim the territory as part of their own nation, thus putting devolutionary pressure on Ukraine to split. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and click here to grab my AP Human Geography Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. It's the fastest way to study, and I think you're gonna love it. So, I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.